All right. So in our last 30 or 45 minutes or so, I want to delve into this question about how the body influences the brain, and how our physiological states can influence our emotions and our perceptions of our social worlds. And like I mentioned briefly at the beginning, I think we're pretty people are getting better at thinking about this direction, right? And thinking about how negative and positive emotions can influence what's happening inside of the body. But I think what we tend to think a little bit less about is this other direction. So how do changes in our bodily states feed back to our brains to influence our emotions and our social experiences? And so I want to talk briefly at the beginning about a series of studies that I really love, that I think have some important implications for the ways that we think about our bodies as either helpful or harmful. I love this quote from William James, sort of the founder of modern psychology. And he said that the greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. And really this idea that, we'll all encounter difficult, challenging, stressful circumstances, but that the way that we think about them can really influence the results of those experiences. So this is a couple of studies I'm going to tell you about by some researchers in the U.S., Jeremy Jameson, who's a professor at the University of Rochester, and Wendy Berry-Mendez, who's a professor at the University of California, San Francisco. And they really embarked on this line of investigation, asking if changing the way we're thinking about or reappraising our physiological activation during stressful or anxiety-provoking experiences can change not only how we respond to those experiences in the moment, but also change our performance in those situations. So kind of the initial starting point for this research is this biopsychosocial theory of stress, which says that there are, among others, kind of two dominant ways that people tend to respond to stressful situations, either with a challenge response or a threat response. So a threat response, I think, is what we sort of classically think of as stress. So it's when a person encounters a performance-based situation and perceives that the demands of the situation overwhelm their resources to deal with the situation. That sort of perception of greater demands than resources leads to the experience of anxiety, leads to a greater maladaptive physiological activation, and worse performance. So you can imagine, let's say, a person who you have two people who both are told at the beginning of a course that they're going to have to give a presentation. So public speaking is an anxiety-provoking experience for most people. So someone who makes a threat appraisal has a threat response to that situation might think, oh my gosh, I'm such a terrible public speaker. I don't have enough time to prepare. I'm so busy. The demands of this situation are overwhelming my resources to deal with it. And therefore, I'm going to experience a lot of anxiety, have a lot of physiological activation, and probably not do as well on that presentation. On the other hand, people might have a challenge response to a stressful situation. So challenge responses are really the perception that certainly demands exist, right? I'm going to have to do this thing, give this presentation that's hard. that's going to be challenging, but I have resources for coping. I know how to prepare. I can practice in front of my friends. I can take a lot of time to make sure that I'm prepared for giving this presentation. So it will be hard. It's not like I'm going to be totally relaxed and chilled out about having to do this presentation, but I'm perceiving it more as a challenge. It's a hard situation, but sort of I can do it, as opposed to a threat. And challenge appraisals are associated with less anxiety, sort of lower physiological activation in some respects, but not completely. It's not as though people who make challenge appraisals are just like flat in terms of their physiology, right? They're still going to have some activation, but it's just more adaptive. It's helping blood get to the brain more effectively than someone who's making a threat appraisal. And they'll actually perform better on these stressful tasks. So lots of research has established that these two patterns exist, and they're associated with these differences in anxiety and in physiology and in performance. And so what they were interested in looking at in this set of studies is if we can change people's appraisals of or perceptions of their physiological activation. So we've all had this experience, I think, of your heart's racing, your palms get sweaty, maybe you're thinking about asking a question to a speaker, you're thinking about giving a presentation, or you're giving a musical performance or a dance performance, or whatever it might be, an important meeting with your boss. And we often perceive that physiological activation, that palm sweaty, heart racing thing, as stress, right? As threatening. But what if we could change our perceptions of those physiological conditions to challenge? What if now I'm not seeing my heart beating faster and my palms getting sweatier as indicative of this is a situation that I need to feel threatened in, but rather this is a situation that's going to demand some performance of me, but I can do it. So that's what they were trying to study in this set of studies. So the basic research question was pretty simple. Can altering people's appraisals or their perceptions or thoughts about stress and the physiological responses to stress promote a more adaptive physiological response during the stressor itself and lead to less attentional biases to threat? So more specifically, they wondered, can reappraising our arousal as positive be an effective stress reduction technique compared to ignoring our physiological cues or no intervention at all? Okay, so to investigate this question in their first study, they brought 50, these are healthy young adult participants, into the lab, and they had 3 conditions for their intervention. So in the control condition, just nothing happened. They read some neutral reading material and hung out. In the ignore external cues condition. Okay, so sorry, I should say everyone is told that they're going to have to give a speech. Similar to the stress task that I've been talking about throughout our sessions, they're going to have to stand up and give a quick speech to a panel of people who are going to be evaluating them. In one of the intervention sort of control conditions, people are basically told to ignore the external cues in the environment. So they're told the best way to reduce nervousness and improve outcomes is to just ignore the source of the stress. So when you're completing your speech, focus your attention on the X placed to the left of the evaluators. Sort of don't look and don't attend to the evaluators themselves. Focus your attention a little bit away. So this is a pretty tight control condition, right? They didn't expect this to be associated with better outcomes because there's actually no evidence that ignoring sources of stress is beneficial. In fact, it might be harmful if we're sort of suppressing our responses. So here was the key condition that they were interested in. This is the reappraising arousal condition. So participants in this condition of the intervention were told that increased arousal during stressful situations isn't harmful. Instead, our body's response to stress have evolved to help us successfully address stressors. And that increased arousal actually aids in performance in stressful situations. So arousal during stress is functional and adaptive. So if you have this experience of your heart starts racing, your palms get sweaty, that's good. That's going to help you. That's a positive thing. It's not something to be threatened by or anxious about. So then after participants were randomly exposed to one of these 3 different conditions, everyone did this evaluative speech task, and they measured their physiology throughout the experience. And then afterward, they also completed a task called the Shue task that basically is a way of measuring people's attention to threat. So if people are more attentive to threatening cues in their environment. Okay, so here's what they found in terms of physiology. So on the y-axis here, this is TPR, total peripheral resistance. It's basically how much resistance is in your blood vessels in your arteries. So you want this to be low because you want blood to be able to get out to your limbs and to your brain during a stressor. This is called cardiac output. It's basically how much blood is your heart pumping out. So sort of an ideal situation, right? During a stressor, think about like classic fight or flight responses. We want physiological activation. We want our heart to be effectively pumping. We want our heart to be pumping blood, but we want it to be pumping blood effectively so it can get to our organs and our brains. So we want cardiac output to be higher and total peripheral resistance to be lower. Okay, so in the control condition, so this is where participants aren't given any intervention, you see kind of the classic finding during the stressor, TPR, total peripheral resistance, goes up, cardiac output doesn't change or goes down even slightly. In the ignore condition, so this is the condition where participants were told, just ignore the source of the stress, don't pay attention to the evaluators, focus your attention on this X. We see a little bit less, but still an increase in total peripheral resistance and not much change in cardiac output. Then for participants who were in the reappraise condition, who were told, hey, look, this arousal that you're going to experience during this stressor, it's not bad. It's good for you. It's going to help you. It's positive. They show this very nice pattern of lower total peripheral resistance. So their blood is more effectively getting to where it needs to go in the body, and greater cardiac output. So their heart is pumping more blood. So fascinating, right? Just the act of changing how you think about your physiological arousal can change how you respond physiologically during a stressor. All that's changing is people's perceptions of what to make of this physiological arousal that they're going to experience. Okay, turning to this question of attentional bias to threat. So how does changing our appraisals of our arousal influence our subsequent responses to threatening information? So in the control condition, individuals showed increased interference, meaning greater attentional bias to threat. They were more attentive to threatening words compared to non-threatening words. In the ignore condition, you actually see an even bigger increase. So people showed greater attention to threat, kind of this paradoxical finding that sort of trying to ignore threat in one situation actually transfers to greater perceptions of threat in another situation. But in the reappraisal condition, people did not show any bias toward the threatening information after the stressor. So again, just changing people's perceptions of their arousal and their physiology during a demanding experience leads to more effective physiology and less bias toward threat. So I think this is fascinating, and it really suggests this mind over matter phenomenon, right? That changing our appraisals of our body during stressful, demanding situations can have positive effects on people's physiological and psychological responses to stressors. So they show more adaptive cardiovascular responses and are less attentive to threatening information. So I think what this suggests is, rather than seeing our bodies as sort of hurting us, if we can start to view our bodies and their naturalistic responses to situations as helping us, as facilitating our performance, we can really change stress responses to being more adaptive. Okay, so you might think this is all well and good, but, who cares? This is a sort of artificial situation that we've created in the lab. We're having people do this speech that they don't particularly care about. Can this strategy of reappraising our arousal as positive actually improve performance in situations that matter? So to address this question, Dr. Jameson, Dr. Mendez, along with some colleagues, ran another fascinating study where they tried to look at if having people reappraise their physiological arousal could influence exam performance. So I think probably all of us here at some point in our lives have had the experience of taking a high-stakes exam, right? Whether it's, back in high school for college entrance, if it's an exam in an important course at university, if it's an exam for going on to graduate school or for a promotion within a company. These exam performance situations are super stressful. There's so much on the line. And a lot of people experience a lot of arousal during these situations. And so what Jameson and Mendez asked was basically if teaching people to interpret their arousal as positive could improve their performance on these high-stakes testing situations. Okay, so very similar to the last study, they did this very simple intervention where everyone in the study read, all right, so the goal of this research is to examine how physiological arousal during a test correlates with performance. And because it's normal for people to feel anxious during standardized tests, we're going to have you provide some saliva samples, and we're going to analyze those saliva samples for hormones that are indicative of your arousal. Okay, so everyone's kind of on the same page. People in the intervention condition, after reading this information, also read, people think that feeling anxious while taking a standardized test will make them do poorly on the test. However, recent research suggests that arousal doesn't actually hurt performance on these tests and can even help performance. So people who feel anxious during a test might actually do better. This means you shouldn't feel concerned if you do feel anxious while taking today's test. If you find yourself feeling anxious, simply remind yourself that your arousal could actually be helping you. Could be making you do better. So super simple way of changing people's perceptions of their anxiety. I was a swimmer when I was younger, and one of my swim coaches, way before this research was done, who didn't know anything about science, I don't think, but used to say, if you were nervous, it was good because it meant you were taking it seriously. And that was like this, I think, way of that he was helping us do this exact thing, which is that, you know, you're going to be nervous before a big race, but it doesn't mean that you're not ready or that that's a bad thing. It means, you know, it's good. You're taking it seriously. Same kind of idea here. Okay, so people went through this intervention, and then they took a practice. This was for the graduate record exam. So it's a big exam that sort of determines your entrance into a lot of graduate programs in the US. Not only did they take a practice version of the exam, these are people who were actually planning to take the GRE for real in their lives to determine where they would go to college, or sorry, where they would go to graduate school. So they looked both at how the intervention influenced performance on this practice test in the lab, but also how it influenced their actual performance on the GRE when they took it within a few weeks of completing the study. Okay, so here's what they found. In terms of the practice exam, so the one that they just did in the lab, people who were instructed to reappraise their arousal, reappraise that anxiety that they might feel while taking the test as positive, as maybe helping performance, did significantly better on the math portion of this exam than people who were not given any intervention, who were in the control condition. No effects on verbal performance, kind of interesting, but significant increases in performance on the math section of this test, just by changing the way that people thought about their anxiety and their physiological arousal during this test. Okay, again, you might say that's all well and good, but what about, you know, actual exam performance when there's really something on the line? Very, very similar effects. So once again, people who'd been taught that anxiety is normal, in some cases it's actually probably good, it could be helping you to do better, they showed better performance on the math portion of the exam than people who weren't given those instructions. People are randomly assigned to these intervention conditions, right? This is critical. We're just randomly flipping a coin and saying, okay, you get the intervention, you don't. And these effects hold even when you control for important things that you think might be confounds. So things like their undergraduate GPA, their SAT scores, so how they did on a standardized test entering university, and the time they reported spending studying for the GRE. So even after you control for all those things, just changing the way that you think about your arousal during stress improves math performance. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that this isn't just an effect of sort of relaxation or lack of arousal. So you might think, okay, if we're taught to think of our arousal as good, then it just blocks it. People are just less physiologically aroused. They're just, you know, more relaxed. That's actually not true. So they find that people in the reappraisal condition, this is salivary alpha amylase. I talked about this briefly yesterday. It's a marker of sympathetic nervous system activation. People in the reappraisal condition actually shows greater levels of salivary alpha amylase, this sympathetic nervous system marker. So it's not as though they're just totally relaxed and kind of flat physiologically. They do increase, actually significantly more than people in the other condition. They're just not thinking about that as bad. They're actually thinking about, you know, this arousal as potentially good and helping. So it's not something to shut down and to sort of be afraid of anymore. It's something that's good, that's going to facilitate my performance. So once again, thinking about our physiological arousal as helping us, not hurting us, as long as we appraise it that way, is really helpful. Okay, so I think this work is fascinating and really important, and suggests that this really simple and very brief intervention teaching students that arousal and anxiety during test taking is totally normal and may actually help with performance, leads to better scores on a high-stakes exam that has big implications for people's lives in the real world. I think we should be doing this. I try to do it with my students all the time when I'm teaching. But in our classrooms, in our boardrooms, in clinics, elsewhere, teaching people that your body is here to help you, and that the arousal that you might experience during performance-based situations is a good thing, and you want to harness that. That's there to help you. It's not something to be threatened by or afraid of. It's powerful, and I think it can really improve people's outcomes. I do think it's important to think about the timing. When do we tell people this information? And sort of when might it help versus not? So, there we talked a little bit briefly earlier about, people have full-blown clinical performance test anxiety. This might not be that effective, but for people within, normative ranges, I think it could be very effective. And I think, it's interesting to think about that the mechanism for this is adaptive physiological arousal. So challenge appraisals instead of threat appraisals. It's not shutting down the body. It's just saying that the bodily activation is good. Okay. Any thoughts on reappraising arousal? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if anyone has looked at that specifically, but presumably that's part of what people are doing, right? They get told this information from an external source, and then they're probably reminding themselves of that through kind of self-talk during the actual exam. I definitely think that's probably part of it going on. Yeah, good question. Other questions about harnessing physiology, the body being good? Okay, so I want to end by briefly telling you a little bit about some recent research that I've been doing. Again, going back to this, how does the body influence the brain? Focusing on the immune system and how inflammatory activation in the body might influence our emotions and our social functioning. So as I mentioned on Thursday, there's sort of this intimate connection between our social experiences and the way that our immune system functions. And specifically that proteins, shown here called pro-inflammatory cytokines, that are orchestrators of the body's inflammatory response, are responsive to our social experiences. And what I want to suggest here is that our physiological activation in the form of greater increases in inflammation leads to a set of symptoms that we call sickness behaviors. So greater activation of the immune system has been shown to lead to a number of physical symptoms. This makes sense, right? Think about the last time that you were feeling kind of crummy, like a little under the weather, but not so bad that you had to stay at home in bed. You're still going to go to work, or you're still going to go to school. You feel like a little under the weather, but you're not totally laid out in bed. So these proteins, these inflammatory cytokines, predict increases in physical symptoms like fever, fatigue, pain sensitivity, appetite loss, sort of all those physical symptoms that we experience when we're getting a little sick. And interestingly, they also predict a set of affective and social symptoms. So in addition to causing these physical changes, increases in inflammation in the body can cause depressed mood, can cause anhedonia, or the loss of pleasure in things that normally bring pleasure and reward, and can lead to social withdrawal, or sort of just withdrawing from our social environments. And we've been trying to understand a little bit more about how this works. So how do these chemical messengers of the immune system, these pro-inflammatory cytokines, how do they signal us to influence our brains, to cause us to experience less pleasure and to socially withdraw? And specifically, what's happening in the brain when we're in an inflamed state that's leading to these changes? So we know that pro-inflammatory cytokines can cause depressed mood and perceived social disconnection. They cause greater activity in brain regions involved in processing pain in response to social rejection. They cause greater activity in the amygdala, this key salience or threat processing region, in response to threatening faces. And they might also lead to anhedonia. So in animal models, greater increases in levels in cytokines cause lower consumption of palatable foods and lower levels of sexual behavior. So things that would normally bring pleasure and reward, animals who are in an inflamed state are not engaging in those behaviors as much. And actually humans show reduced activation in reward pathways, reduced activation in the ventral striatum when they are winning monetary rewards. So what about social rewards? That was the thing we were really interested in tackling. How might increases in inflammation in the body influence the way our brains respond to positive social information? So we might predict, based on these findings, that people would experience less pleasure, less reward from social connections during an inflamed state. But actually, some animal research suggests that during times of sickness and inflammation, animals actually huddle more with familiar cage mates. They sort of become more connected to other animals who they're familiar with. And so there's really no human research in this area. So that's what we were trying to tackle. So just as a model for what we were thinking about, times of sickness. Again, you're still at work, you're feeling kind of crummy. And we know, and I think it makes sense that during these types of experiences, we might not want to engage in social interactions with unfamiliar others, or in social interactions that could not be positive or not be pleasant. So we probably wouldn't want to go on a first date, right? We probably wouldn't want to go to a cocktail party with a bunch of people who we don't really know. I think that makes sense. And it makes sense evolutionarily. We are, already in a compromised state. We're already sort of sick and inflamed. So we don't want to interact with other people who could do us more harm, potentially. But think about the last time you didn't feel very good, and how you might have responded to positive social situations. So this is my husband, Dave. And I think when I'm feeling crummy, I actually want to be around him even more. So it's not as though I'm completely getting no pleasure from social situations. In fact, I don't want to go meet someone new or go interact with a bunch of strangers, but I really want to interact with a partner, with a support figure, mom or someone along those lines. And maybe I might even be more attentive to someone who could be providing cues of care. So imagine this is a person who's going to give me some chicken soup. Not a support figure, not someone I have a long-standing relationship with, but someone who's providing some cues that I'm going to help you. So that's what we were really focusing on in this line of work. So does sickness, does inflammation lead to reductions in reward pathways in the brain to social situations generally? Or does it actually lead to increases in reward pathways in response to support figures and in response to cues of potential social connection or people who mean to give us care? I'm going to skip, in the interest of time, to our findings. So basically how we did this quickly was we brought people into the lab, and to induce an inflammatory response in the body, we expose them to an inflammatory challenge. So we actually, it sounds scary, but I promise it's not. We inject them with a little bit of the cell wall of the E. coli bacteria. So this causes a big increase in levels of inflammation in the body. People feel a little crummy, but it's totally safe and time limited. They feel back to normal after about 6 hours when we let them go home. But yeah, we need them to feel crummy for a little while so we can study how it affects them.
How did you get the ethical approach?
Yeah. There's a lot of ethical hoops to jump through, for sure. But they know what they're getting involved in. So they provide blood samples that we use to measure levels of inflammation. And then they report on their physical symptoms, and then we scan them, again using functional MRI, when levels of inflammation are at their peak. Okay, so in the first task in this study, they got social feedback from a stranger. This is similar to the task I showed you on Thursday, so I'm not going to go into all the details. But basically, they get feedback from an evaluator on an interview that they've done with us that we videotaped. And they get to see in real time during their scan what this evaluator thinks about them, right? So they see this mouse cursor moving around the screen, clicking on different adjectives, both neutral, like sensible, positive feedback words, like you seem interesting, and then also negative feedback words. So this is just to show you that indeed, getting injected with a bit of the cell wall of the E. coli bacteria causes a massive increase in levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines in the body. So this is interleukin-6, one commonly measured cytokine. This is tumor necrosis factor alpha, also a common cytokine. And here are the people who are exposed to the inflammatory challenge. They show a big increase. People who weren't are basically flat. So just showing, yes, this does lead to a change in inflammation. When we looked at how their brains responded to negative compared to neutral feedback, we found that individuals who were exposed to endotoxin, who had more inflammation in their bodies, had much greater activation in neural systems involved in responding to pain and in thinking about others' thoughts and feelings. This is in response to the negative feedback, right? And I think this makes sense. If you're sick, if you're in a compromised state, you should want to be very aware of potential additional threats in your environment, people who mean to do you harm. And so your brain should be sort of on the ready to respond to these types of situations, which is what we see. What about for the positive, right? This is what we were really interested in. What about when people were getting positive feedback, like you seem interesting? We looked at how activation in neural regions involved in responding to reward and value. And again, we saw increases among individuals exposed to this endotoxin, this inflammatory challenge, in neural systems involved in reward in response to the positive feedback. So people showed greater activity in the ventral striatum and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So this suggests that when individuals are in an inflamed state, they show heightened neural sensitivity to both negative and to positive social feedback. And I think this really was a call to the field of psychoneuroimmunology, the field that studies how the immune system influences social and psychological processes, and how psychological processes influence the immune system, to say, hey, it's not that inflammation just causes people to feel less pleasure, to feel less anhedonia. In fact, they might show greater reward sensitivity to some positive social information. And this could be good if it's leading them to experience situations, be attentive to people who mean to potentially provide care. We find a very similar pattern when we have people look at images of their support figures. So we ask them to send us an image of someone who could provide care or comfort to them during a time of need. And we find the same pattern. People exposed to this inflammatory challenge show greater activation in neural reward systems in response to viewing images of their support figures compared to strangers. And that's greater for people who are inflamed compared to those who aren't. So again, what I think is so fascinating here is that it really suggests that the brain is listening in to what's happening in the body, right? It's the immune system is influencing how our brain is computing social information. And it's leading us to be more sensitive potentially to negative information, but also potentially more sensitive to positive information. And I think the implications of this are big, given that inflammation is elevated in a lot of chronic disease states. So a lot of people are sort of walking around the world, leading their daily lives in this chronic state of inflammation in their bodies. And that could be really influencing their social health and their psychological health more, I think, than we've typically thought of. So again, not just the mind and the brain influencing the body, but also the brain listening in to what's happening in the body. And for both good and bad, I think leading us to change our psychological experiences and our social experiences. So I guess I'm going to end on that note. I don't know if that's a positive note to end on or a not so positive note to end on, but this has been really fun for me. Thank you for being here. Thank you. I hope more than anything that you've taken away that the brain is playing such a critical role in all of our psychological experiences. And I think we can harness neuroscience techniques to help us figure out which interventions are going to be effective, how interventions are effective, why they're effective, and then also just for understanding our social and psychological experiences. So thank you so much again for being here. I will hang out for as long as anyone wants to talk to me. So if you have questions or you want to follow up, please feel free to come chat. And thank you again for being here on your weekend and on your Saturday. It's been great. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, please join me to give a big applause to Keely again. Thank you. I'll give you a high five, okay? You will see your honey soon. And also, we thank you for the support from every one of you, especially for those who have attended all 3 sections. How many of you have attended all 3 sections? Yeah, let's give them a high five. Yeah. Yeah. I think all of you agree that Keely is not only a great scholar and researcher, but she is also an excellent teacher. I think she can present some very hard and difficult neuroscience and physiological research findings in a kind of understandable and easy way. And I think relatively it's quite easy, better than Nicholson. And also, I think Keely's mentioned that in her disclaimer over the last few days, we would like to keep the dialogue between the researchers and practitioners among us. Because I think we all learn from Keely's that the social and emotional experience related and connected to our neurological and physiological responses that are good to our well-being. So I think from Keely's talk, I think we can see there are a lot of opportunities. And yeah, so there are several ways we can enhance our dialogue. First, from in your folder, there is a survey. Please take a few minutes to fill that out and give us some valuable comments. And the secondly, on the back of the survey, there is a schedule of our positive neuroscience series. Actually, we apologize that we should print that on the back of the poster rather than on the survey. But you can take a photo of that. Actually, next month, in the middle of July, we will have another short course on social neuroscience. But this time we'll look at how social neuroscience can change our behaviors from antisocial to prosocial. I know some of the audience here from Hong Kong police. That's very important, I think. And then, thirdly, I think we have learned a lot, right? But we also have forgotten a lot from these 3 days. I think because Keely has prepared a very comprehensive presentation, over 170 slides. But we will get the permission from Keely, and then we will send out to all of you, so you can review, refresh your memory. Yeah, you may get a little bit nervous when you get a PowerPoint with over 150 or 170 pages, but it's okay. That's good to us, right? When you get a little bit nervous, I learned from you. Yeah. And fourthly, lastly, we don't stop here. We hope we can keep the dialogue, and then we can keep in touch with one another. I think from Keely's talk, I think there are a lot of opportunities we can establish collaborations between researchers and practitioners to enhance our practice, to support the well-being of human beings, especially those are at risk and in needs. Yeah, that's the purpose of this positive neuroscience series. Okay, and thank you again for coming in these 3 days, despite the bad weather. But I mean, we are very grateful. Actually, the first day, the rain stopped when we begin the seminar. And yesterday, I think we got sunshine, right? Before the section. And today, we finally see the sun. Yeah, so thank you very much again. We hope to see you soon, maybe next month or in the near future, and we will stay in touch. And thank you again for coming, and have a nice weekend. Yeah, and Keely, hope you enjoy the visit in Hong Kong. Yeah, she's great. Yeah, and she will visit Tycoon tomorrow, right? Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks once again. Thank you. Oh, I copied already.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But actually, I even can't open in the email. It's too big.
I know.